I'm going to give you some aspects of global business, which, in addition to a textbook, will represent some of my experiences. So let's start with why is it even necessary to consider global business as a field of study? A few things. Number one, globalization is here to stay in spite of political winds, for or against. Nation to nation, it varies. And businesses will always take advantage of the theory of comparative advantages or resources available, skills and expertise available in different countries for their own benefit. And we need to know that. And also because all business is based on human behavior, and it is fascinating to understand how things like geography, history, culture, religion, social mores impact traditional business disciplines like finance, HR, manufacturing, production, etc., with the modification of culture and religions, so on. Also, we need to know that probably from the beginning of time, trade has always existed across boundaries. In those days, there may not have been the nation states with hard boundaries that we know of today, but there were some boundaries, and people would go across those boundaries to take advantage of trade. The Greeks and the Romans, the Greeks first and then the Romans, they created, influenced, and created the entire Western civilization, but it all started with trade: olives, grapes, wine, and many other commodities. In the same way, in the Middle East, the Silk Road, as an example, took products from the East to the West and vice versa. Think about noodles in China and spaghetti in Italy, brought by Marco Polo. In India also, there was a tremendous influence of the Indian culture on countries like Thailand and Malaysia and Indonesia and Cambodia. In fact, some of the edifices in Angkor Wat in Cambodia are all based on Indian influences, but it all started with trade. And trade really influences the conduct of global business and vice versa. Again, influenced by culture, populations, history, economics, systems, formal, informal, legal systems, etc. There have been in the past and continue to be more accelerators for this concept of globalization. In the 16th century, starting in the 15th century, after the Renaissance in Europe and the competition between the European nations for both wealth and power, they forayed out, starting with Spain and Portugal in the 15th century, Vasco da Gama to India, and many other explorations. And the age of what they called exploration turned into the age of colonization. Having discovered gold in South America, spices in the Indies, European nations started to trade and then started to control the sources of these products. After the next step, after controlling the sources of these products, they imposed control on the populations, and that is what became known as colonization because they were colonies of the European countries. South America, in fact, North America also was a subject of colonization by the British and the French. South America, primarily Spain and Portugal, Africa, all the European nations, starting with the Dutch, the Netherlands, followed by the French in the north. So all of North Africa is French speaking, French influenced. Then the British came on and then they started to take on these territories after the wars with France. And then the Belgians and the Germans went into the central part of Africa, the Congo. India, very similarly, everyone came there. The Dutch came, the British came, the French came, and then the wars between all of these countries finally established the British rule over India, which was a very fragmented country at that time. Colonization both helped but and or deterred the growth of these colonized nations. The benefits were instituted systems of education, legal systems, um, administrations, etc. The negative was it was all done by the colonizers, not by the people who were the general population. They brought in industrialization, the colonizers did, but mainly to speed up production, increase mechanization. Example, the railways, the sugar, which started with the sugar cane industry, and the British took that all over the world, in fact. So the West Indies was founded because of sugar and sugar cane, as well as Cuba and various other countries where the agriculture supported sugarcane. Other accelerators in the more recent past have been the wars, the First World War, the Second World War, any war, as a matter of fact, really spurred manufacturing capabilities because all the manufacturing capabilities were repurposed for the war effort, weaponry, munitions, and in fact, new industries were spawned, new discoveries, all because of war efforts. And that this was the First World War, the Second World War, the Korean War, and subsequently we are seeing that the Cold War. After the Second World War, in fact, even for a period of time after the First World War, when uh, the the Allies won, countries like Turkey and the Ottoman Empire, which was destroyed, uh, did not have any resources. So the manufacturing facilities that were in the West and especially in the United States were repurposed for consumer items, textiles, mechanized products, even agriculture, automobiles, electronics in the future. And the US, after the Second World War, because almost all of Europe was decimated, certainly Germany and Japan, instituted the Marshall Plan for the reconstruction of Europe, which created both a market for US products as well as allowed US influence, political influence, to be exercised over these countries. Now, Japan and Germany learned very fast and they caught up, and other countries too. And then what happened was that the market share that the US took for granted started to diminish. The US, rightly or wrongly, wanted to institutionalize market economics, which was synonymous to consumer economics. So a lot of consumerism, buying of products, and because there was plenty in the US at that time, uh, people could afford to buy. They bought dishwashers and washing machines and various other appliances made in US factories. However, as always, profit reigns supreme. And in order to maximize profits, US manufacturers started to look for cheaper and cheaper sources of manufacturing, Japan being the first to take on electronics, camera making, all the lenses, even automobiles. Think about Honda, Toyota, Nissan. And Japan learned from the US. They took technologies, they took methodologies, improved upon them, and and whilst they were able to supply their trade increased with the United States, they were able to supply. The costs of production at home started to go up. Obviously, when the cost of production in Japan started to go up, profits for the US companies was less and less. And so they moved manufacturing, and Japanese companies did too, to remain competitive. to places like Taiwan, and then Taiwan to Hong Kong, Hong Kong to mainland China. Mainland China started to become more expensive in terms of labor costs. They moved to Vietnam. Malaysia was an outsourced country for some period of time, but it starts to find, like water, its own level, and it goes to cheaper and cheaper sources of labor, which is obviously called labor arbitrage. In the 1970s, the interesting thing was in the search for cheaper labor, and when Nixon opened up China, China was hungry. It really wanted to, you know, come into the modern age. And they embraced all of that. And with the state controlled and totalitarian regimes, they were able to institute policies and procedures which allowed the West to take advantage of the populations and land and manufacturing facilities in China, made China what it is today, which is the second largest economy in the world in 50 years. I was fascinated, and I recommend you watch a Smithsonian show called Aerial China, and you'd see the mind-boggling growth of China. At this point in time, and this may be somewhat accurate, the economies of the world, look at the contrast. The United States is 30 trillion, China is 19, um, maybe 20 trillion. Germany at 4.74, India at 4.17, Japan at 4.16 trillion are less than a quarter of China. So that is amazing to know, and it demonstrates how fast China has grown. There are discussions about which is the largest economy in terms of GDP versus purchasing power parity, which we won't discuss here. It's a matter of economics, and it should be considered, but it's for another day. We need to know who the major players are. And we will start right here at home, the United States. The United States was founded after the colonization by England, which was very interesting. England wanted to colonize the land mass of the United States because of timber to start with, and then cotton and other natural resources. And then, of course, in the 18th century, 1776, culminating with the independence of the United States from Britain. The US was a nation formed by immigrants, essentially starting with European nations. It's a democratic, and our founding fathers decided that it will be a democratic and a secular country, will not have any royalty and kings, but it's a democratically elected governance. And apart from freedom of speech and religion, it also kind of guaranteed freedom of trade, which led to what the definition of what we call market economics. Like I said earlier, the economy is about 30 trillion. One of the biggest advantages after the Second World War and the elimination of the gold standard was the US dollar became the reserve currency of the world, which means a lot of transactions took place in the US dollar, which is a standard. Currency exchanges with the euro in the European Union, the renminbi in China, the ruble in Russia, the rupee in India, uh, and various other currencies started to be measured against the US dollar as the standard. Uh, One of the big reasons for the US dollar to be the reserve currency was because of the stability of the United States, the rule of law, the legal system, and the ability to do free trade. And anybody could come from all over the world and do trade. Um, there is some discussion about whether other countries took advantage of the US having no tariffs or duties on imports, whereas they had duties on imports in their own countries. But at the end of the day, it was the US companies that really gained a lot of money because of the import of products from different countries at a cheaper cost and the rise of consumerism in the United States. One of the reasons why there was so much money in the US was that the US was able to borrow money at extremely low rates, being the safest place in the world to hold money. The rich countries, um, they kept on buying treasury bonds, which is our way of acquiring foreign wealth, if you will, and guaranteeing that we will pay interest on the bonds. Japan is the largest holder of U.S. Treasury bonds at about 1.2 trillion. China at maybe 750 or is the second largest. They're different countries. Almost every country in the world has U.S. Treasuries because that's their hedge against fluctuations of currency and inflation. U.S. was paying very low rates of interest because of its stability and was able to command 1, 2, or even 3% interest. These days, it's slightly higher because of the rate of inflation. As I said earlier, in the United States, the economy really grew after World War II, World War One, but certainly after World War II, because it was, um, for all intents and purposes, the last man standing. The rest of the world did not have the capacity. China had not yet come online at all. In fact, Europe was decimated, as well as Japan. India had just come out or from under the yoke of colonization after the Second World War, had no capacity to produce and compete with the US. So, as the last man standing in the only manufacturing and developed economy in the world, it had a monopoly on manufacturing and products and even services, which financial services, because of the reserve currency, the US dollars, really grew up. As I said earlier, in order to maximize profits, labor arbitrage was perfected in the US. Japan, Taiwan, South Korea, Hong Kong, China, mainland China, Vietnam, Malaysia, Bangladesh, and now Bangladesh, Jordan, and other countries. The manufacturing sector did choose, which is debatable now, whether to stay away from what you may call polluting industries, steel being one of them. In those days, steel was being manufactured with coal converted to coking coal, firing blast furnaces and steel melting shops or steel melting furnaces. Uh, these days, it's cleaner technology because scrap, which has been generated over all these decades, is then now being remelted and then repurposed to make steel of different types. You can make stainless steel, add vanadium, molybdenum, chromium, and other metals to make different types of steel. Uh, and perhaps that is a way of reviving the steel industry in the United States, which was outsourced to countries like China and Japan and India because of pollution, because they didn't want to increase, So that was the Rust Belt, if you will, in the US, uh, Ohio, Michigan, Pennsylvania. That Rust Belt had all the steel and manufacturing based on steel. And those jobs were lost. Those jobs were lost, including textiles in North Carolina. North Carolina was one of the world's leaders in textile manufacturing, but that was lost to lower priced countries. And those jobs went on. But because the United States did not commensurately, they did not invest in um, skills development and education for the higher 21st century jobs, if you may call them. They did not invest. Firms did. Firms bought on to the fact that there are other jobs, which today is like AI jobs, robotics, etc., etc. But firms imported talent. They did not spend money because they felt that that is government and private industries' job uh, to provide skills and education to the general public, firms went to different countries, either outsourced development or imported talent as they needed. The home base of people did not gain from this shift from manufacturing to higher technical technology based jobs. And in fact, the mass population does feel left behind. Firms became richer and richer. The people who owned those firms really became richer. So to speak, the gap between the rich and the poor really widened. And although it is not because of globalization alone, globalization is blamed for this gap between the rich and the poor. Maybe right or maybe wrong. That's for you to consider. We'll move forward to China, which is again a fascinating country. It was born out of the revolution. It was colonized and it had, the Song dynasty and various other dynasties were ruling even up to the First World War. And there was a movie called The Last Emperor, which some years ago, which was really good on this subject. But uh, England started to trade, Britain and the United Kingdom, or the East India Company, in fact, not even the Crown, started to trade with China because of their base in India. And they started to take products from India to China and vice versa. They brought tea from China to India, took it from India to Kenya and Sri Lanka. So India, Kenya, Sri Lanka are the largest tea producers in the world after China. China is still a very large tea producer. But they did take, in order to pay for that tea, they did take opium, which was in India. Actually, it was more in Afghanistan, in the Golden Triangle or whatever it's called, uh, and the poppy development there. And they took opium and took it to China. And in fact, huge populations of Chinese became addicted to opium. And then there was a war, the Boxer Revolution, as they called it in China, wanted to throw the British out, and the British fought. And cities like Shanghai were the subject of these wars and control mechanisms. And England wanted to control the population, keep them kind of in addicted to opium so that products could be taken out. And so China became extremely poor, and as did India at that point in time, because the colonizers took everything away from there. And in the Second World War, Japan invaded China, and and because the United States and Japan were on different sides, the U.S. helped China to fight Japan, and in the process created uh, Mao Zedong, Mao Zedong, and this was in the late 30s, and there was the massacre of Nanking perpetrated by the Japanese in China, which really gave a boost to the Chinese movement of independence. And Mao Zedong, in the late 40s, after Japan was defeated and their attention was to defend themselves with the Battle of Midway, and then the Allies going into almost threatening Tokyo and Japan. Uh, Mao Zedong undertook what was called the Long March, all the way from the north of China to the south. And the Long March uh, created, and he adopted the Marxist, the Russian model of governance, which was what we call communist or socialist. And he then united the country as a totalitarian regime. Uh, it was very isolated at that time, very isolated. And Mao Zedong did not allow a lot of development. In fact, with the what was called in the early 60s the Cultural Revolution, he purged the intelligentsia and education and so on and so forth. And I, one does not know why, but he agreed to meet with Richard Nixon in 1976. And Nixon had been trying to open China. bring China into the fold uh, of trade, because I think the U.S. realized that with that kind of population, it's going to be a huge market. And after that, for many years, nothing really happened until Mao died, and Deng Xiaoping became his successor. Deng Xiaoping, although having been brought up in under the Marxist philosophies, did have this feeling that China is being left behind. And he undertook a tour to Europe, the West. He went to Europe, he came to the US, and he was it was mind-boggling to him at that time, the gap between where the West was and where China is. And he determined, he said, no matter what happens, I'm going to bring China into modernity. And he started to open up first very close to Hong Kong, which until 1997 was under British rule and therefore very prosperous. And right across the bay from Hong Kong was mainland China. And what Deng Xiaoping did is that he took a corridor in that area and said, this will be like free trade. Anybody can come here, set up industry, set up manufacturing. We will provide the labor, or we will make labor available, and we will provide you with land and all the facilities to set up, and invited companies to come and start manufacturing, which a lot of companies in the West took huge advantage of. As a matter of fact, the person who was instrumental as the as working with Deng Xiaoping is the father of uh, uh, the Chinese premier today, Xi Jinping, and he really instituted this free market and free trade zones in which a lot of the Western manufacturing facilities were set. Imagine from there, in 50 years, China is now the second largest economy per GDP, and some say the biggest economy in terms of purchasing power parity in the world in 50 years. Again, I recommend watch Aerial China. It really brings it home. China, in spite of all the growth, has been an ancient civilization, and the belief systems that were there from way before Confucianism, Taoism, and then from like 200 BCE onward, Buddhism, which came from India. But Buddhism also came to China from India because of trade routes. Buddhism, just to continue that thought, went to Korea from China, and then from Korea to Japan about 600 AD. It has a very diverse 13 languages, 56 ethnicities. Now, these are numbers that are quoted. There may be many, many more. And 1.4 billion people. Used to be, until a few years ago, the largest economy in the world, having been overtaken by India. It has tremendous mineral wealth, is the largest uh, holder and miner of precious metals, um, lithium, and all the stuff that we require for today's electronics is rare earths. All kinds of rare earths are available in China, and is one of the largest deposits in the world. They did invade uh, Tibet, what was called Tibet, and now it's part of China. Uh, in the 50s, uh, in I think it was 56 or 59, that the Dalai Lama overtook an overland or undertook an overland trip from Tibet into India, where he is now in northern India. And one of the reasons was probably China wanted to control the border with India, especially a huge source of the Brahmaputra River, which flows from Tibet into northeast India, as well as the mineral wealth that Tibet probably possesses. Uh, What is fascinating is that, in spite of all the money that China gained, one of the things that the regime did very, very smartly and strategically was to invest in education, in technology and infrastructure. Now, Chinese students as well as Indian students have been the biggest source of foreign students in the United States, even in the most expensive universities, Yale and Harvard and Princeton and MIT, etc. Apart from other uh, universities, again, people from China and India have remained here in the US and have become postdocs and PhDs and engaged in research here, which there is similar research being carried out in both China and India, and sometimes gives rise to where are these people's loyalties? Are they to the US or to China? These questions come up. China is the world's largest exporter. And in order to solidify their control, they have also started many initiatives. One of them is the Belt and Road Initiative. Uh, the fundamental principle on that is that they want to invest in infrastructure in different countries, including ports. They have ports even in the Bahamas owned by Chinese. The Panama Canal, where we are recently, of late, we've been hearing that Trump wants to take over the Panama Canal because he feels that they've handed it over to China. They do have a huge facility. Chinese companies do. And correct or not, I don't know. But they say that these Chinese companies are controlled by the Chinese state. So to be thought about. Uh, China has made huge investments in technology, data centers, and the AI innovation, which has put ChatGPT and others to shame. DeepSeek was generated or developed there at a much lower cost, both in terms of personnel and equipment. Know fully well that China is strong militarily as well as economically and is now flexing its muscle. It wants to exercise control over Taiwan and the South China Sea for the moment, but also has tied up with Pakistan because India is a bone of contention for both the countries. They are moving into the South Indian Ocean to Diego Garcia and other islands, and then all of Africa, North Africa, as well as Central Africa, has been the beneficiary, if you will, of Chinese investment in infrastructure. One of the complaints is that it's a loan, and these countries have not developed the manufacturing or the economies to repay China. So we don't know where that's going to go. I mean, they'll want their pound of flesh. Uh, all the all the construction and the if you will development, including railways in Kenya, where the construction people and the engineers all came from China. They stay back to run those facilities, collect monies from passengers, uh, and have not necessarily handed over those facilities to the local countries in even countries like Kenya, Sri Lanka, Nepal. They're all in that same boat, if you will. I'm now switching gears to India, again sharing a border with China, very ancient culture, a lot of trade, um, a lot of trade relations with China and India going back probably 2000, maybe even more years ago. India has for was an agricultural agrarian country for the longest of time, and for various reasons, it became the spiritual and the philosophical, call it the headquarters of the world. Many religions came out of the earlier, I'm not using the word Hindu to designate any one culture, but the Vedantic or the earlier generations of the Hindu belief were formulated in India, from which today's Hinduism and then Buddhism and Jainism. Buddhism is probably one of the closest thought patterns, if you will, to the first um, philosophies of India. In 1947, it achieved independence from the United Kingdom or Britain or Great Britain. The biggest reason was that Britain could not afford to rule India. But India was under colonial rule from the 11th century onward, when the Muslim invaders coming through Afghanistan from Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, and Central Asia, Turkic tribes came and settled and ruled India. And then the Mughals, who were the descendants of the Mongols, but coming from again Uzbekistan and points east, defeated them. And then so from about 1100 to 1947, India was consistently ruled by somebody else. The general population were subjugated, converted to Islam, converted to Christianity, but still has the largest population today of 1.4 something billion, which is more than China. And the numbers of Hindu believers it's enormous, probably a billion. Uh, One of the beauties of India is that every major religion is practiced. All forms of Christianity, all forms of Islam, all forms of Buddhism, and many, many different forms of Hinduism are all practiced. Up till now, it's been very peaceful. Over the past 4 or 5 decades, we are finding that there is strife. It has the third largest population of Muslims in the world. Um, Indonesia is the largest, Pakistan is number two, but Pakistan and India populations of Muslims is almost the same. Uh, and it truly is a melting pot. We've had, I suppose, migrations of people from the north. So you have blue-eyed, fair people in the north of India and extremely dark African-like features in the south, and anything in the middle. Uh, it has multiple languages, and one of the failing points of India was that all these different, we call them states, just like in the US, the different states, the boundaries of the states were drawn based on the linguistic pattern that existed in India at the time of independence. So Bengali speaking people became Bengal, Punjabi speaking people became Punjab, etc., etc. Now, obviously, you have to factor in 1947, the British broke up India into three areas, two of them belonging to Pakistan, one in the complete West, and Bangladesh. Today's Bangladesh was East Pakistan, West Pakistan, East Pakistan was one country, and India was one. Uh, it for Without the clarity that should have been provided, there is a huge flashpoint in Kashmir today and has been since 1947. Both India and Pakistan claim it. The king of Kashmir had decided that he will be part of India, and Pakistan said, well, the population is majority Muslim, so it should be part of us. Anyway, that's all politics, but geopolitics does have a huge impact on global trade. The advantage for India is that 50% of the population is below 25, and that's going to give India a huge boost in the future. It elected to be a democracy and move toward being more of socialist democracy than a market economic oriented democracy at that time, because there was no money. It was almost bankrupt in 1947. It did inherit election system, legal systems from the British, which is good, and some infrastructure, meaning the railways and some manufacturing. But India did decide to adopt the 5 year planning mechanism, which was in the USSR. They decided to focus on sectors for 5 years at a time, starting with agriculture. India was totally dependent on imports for agriculture, and then they became independent and are net exporters of wheat and other, including sugarcane. Um, and this happened in 3 or 4 decades. then they move to industry, and so on and so forth. So the state planning is a very important department in the Indian government. However, democracy is very messy as opposed to an oligarchy or a totalitarian regime as in China. And largely as a result of that, India is way behind, as we saw, maybe a quarter of China's economy. The other major players, we're not going to cover everybody, but the European Union and Europe are, so here's, you got United States, China, India, the European Union are probably going to be the biggest players in global trade, global business, and economics in the world going forward. Uh, Europe is again very diverse, different countries, different religions, different cultures, just like in India. And almost similar to India in before the British even came there, was there were many warring states. So after the fall of the second, so the Roman Empire was one of these unifying forces which unified Europe and other countries. But after the fall of the Roman Empire in about 700 AD, um, it's had a long history of wars between England and France and Germany, etc., which really is very debilitating. But after the fall of the Roman Empire until the Renaissance in the 15th century, which personified by Michelangelo and Leonardo da Vinci in Italy, um, we call them the Dark Ages. The Catholic Church controlled all of Europe and wanted to keep people controlled, and the popes were more politicians than religious leaders. Um, and it was only after the Renaissance that in England, for example, industrialization, the Industrial Revolution started to take place, went all over Europe, and in the British colonies when they started to colonize. England, such a small country as compared to the whole world, embarked on colonization and empire building. They had to do it in order to even survive and remain competitive. But it did start, as I had said earlier, with Spain and Portugal, uh, with the blessings of the Pope to say, you take the East, Portugal take the East, Spain take the Americas. So the Americas were colonized and populated, and the Catholic religion was instituted by the Spaniards um, since the 15th century. And therefore, almost all of South America, uh, Mexico down, speak Spanish. Different versions of it, of course, but they speak Spanish. The Portuguese did have a stronghold in South America, in Brazil, which speaks Portuguese, and a few other places, but they were mainly in the east. They tried to have a colony in India, but then they lost out, which is Goa, which was there till 1965 as a Portuguese colony. And then they lost it to India because India said that we don't want any foreign powers on our territory, which is a contiguous Indian country. And Portugal also owned Macau, while the British owned Hong Kong just across from each other, which was also a very interesting interaction. In After France, which took over, so to speak, colonized North Africa, and the British defeated the Dutch and took over South Africa and Zimbabwe and Zambia, as it is known today, or was called Rhodesia, and then Botswana, and all these countries. They were English speaking. The north is French speaking, but the middle of Africa, which is the Congo, was colonized by the Germans and the Belgians. They came after the fact, but they did rule that part of it. But a lot of Congo speaks French at this point in time because of the influences of countries just bordering Congo. Colonization, like I said earlier, has had its benefits. I mean, did institutionalize global trade. Um, It's called the first joint stock corporation was called the East India Company. Well, prior to that, the Dutch East India Company was also, so to speak, a joint stock. People issued stock in that company as to investors, and then they bought ships and then went out, traded, bought spices, sold it in the European market, made money and gave dividends. I mean, that was the first principle of companies, the Dutch East India Company and the British East India Company. And they started that. So tea, like I explained earlier, cashews from Brazil, sugar and sugarcane all over the world, in fact, including Hawaii, was settled because of sugarcane. And it influenced, the colonization has influenced in terms of language for sure, like in South America, religion in South America, and the institutionalization of different uh, governance, systems of governance. Like I said earlier, the wars, uh, intestine wars between countries in Europe, as well as the First and Second World War, really weakened Europe. And therefore, they had to relinquish their colonies. It became too difficult to manage. They had to pour money in. And one of the one of the things that happened was the reverse migration of people. The people in the colonies became citizens of these colonizers. So the people in Goa became citizens of Portugal, and some of them moved. The people from Pakistan and India did not become citizens of England, but England did have a lot of migration from these countries. French, people from Algeria and North Africa were eligible for French citizenship and moved there. Uh, the European Common Market and the European Union, as it is now called, is very large and a very critical market. You have tremendous manufacturing facilities in Germany, France, Scandinavian countries, England, and also consumers. So it's a very big market, and China obviously wants to take full advantage of that market, and vice versa. Um, the the thing to be examined is that there is interaction between China and the European Union and the US, and there is the need for a balance between the three. England has a weakness that it is dependent on energy on Russia for gas and oil because it's only the North Sea oil. Uh, Norway is a big, and Scotland and England are big oil producers. Europe has also been on the front line with Russia, and it has been impacted with the Ukraine conflict. But as important, what is considered Europe? Finland is part of Europe. Is Ukraine part of Europe? Is Turkey part of Europe? So these are all discussions that have been taking place over the years. What we need to consider is that geopolitical challenges have tremendous impact on the economics of all countries. The Russia Ukraine conflict has been legendary in the shortage of grains. So one of the thoughts was, why would you starve Africa? Because all the grains used to come from Ukraine, breadbasket of Europe, as it was called. And then maybe because of the truce or whatever agreements were made, grain started to come out. Ukraine has a lot of rare earths and mineral wealth which Russia wants. Russia also has tremendous resources and mineral wealth and rare earths and oil and natural gas. So maybe one of the thoughts was, I take it over and then I'll control the world. We don't know. But the fact is, it has a tremendous impact on the rest of the world. The Gaza and Israel conflict uh, has been painstaking, and really populations have been destroyed and decimated. Um, it's political debate. There is a right to exist. Does everybody have a right to exist, or only one party? Who supports who? For what purpose? The problem has been that between the two countries, there has been a lot of conflict, a lot of deaths, and tremendous destruction of property in Gaza as we know it. The conflict between India and China, I mean India and Pakistan, with Pakistan supported by China, is also something to be considered. The flashpoint is Kashmir. Pakistan, for whatever be the reasons, has not been a democracy. It's been a democracy only in name, ruled entirely by the army, and has not progressed. I mean, people have been poor for the longest of time, the rich have been rich, and uh, potentially for political purposes, they have identified Kashmir as their badge of honor. And India doesn't want to let go of Kashmir. It has invested a lot of money, lot of investment in Kashmir, in education, industry, trying to bring Kashmir up. And Kashmiris are there have been Hindus and Muslims both in Kashmir, so it's not like it's not part of India. But there's that conflict which needs to be watched. The last thing that I want to highlight is the U.S. elections, which have brought up the discussion of whether tariffs and protectionism is the way to economic progress. The debate is on both sides. Um, the jury is still out. We don't know. It's just been 100 days of Trump's becoming president. There's a lot of chaos, a lot of uncertainty. The markets have plummeted. Businesses are not investing because they don't know where to go. But we'll have to see what happens. Uh, where do we go from here? It's an important question to be answered. And it's for you to consider. You need to ponder on where do we go from here? Is protectionism good? What other forms of activity are going to be good? It's for you to consider. I am here to have any kind of discussions we want, and you feel free to email me, or if you have my phone number, to call me. But I'm very willing to participate in any conversation. I want to wish you all the very best in your course. Thanks.